The air backstage was thick and smelled of hairspray and anxiety. 16-year-old Ilara stood in the shadows, her hands clutching each other so tightly her knuckles had turned white. It was a world so far removed from her own that it felt like stepping onto a different planet. Just yesterday she had been mucking out stalls and feeding the chickens, the familiar scent of hay and manure a comforting perfume. Now, all she could smell was the chemical sweetness of aerosol and the faint, electric tang of the massive lights that illuminated the stage just beyond the heavy velvet curtain. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, a frantic, wild rhythm that drowned out the noise of the crew rushing past with headsets and clipboards. They moved with a purpose she didn't understand, their faces tense, their voices barking commands into microphones. To them, she was just another number, another contestant to be herded on and off the stage. She felt profoundly out of place in her simple sky-blue dress. It was one of the few nice things she owned, made by her grandmother from a soft, worn cotton. The hem was slightly faded from washings, and a tiny, loose thread dangled near the seam. On her feet were her scuffed brown leather boots, the same ones she wore every day to work on the farm. They were caked with the faint, dry dust of home, a stubborn reminder of where she came from. Around her, other contestants shimmered. They wore clothes that looked like they had never been worn before, fabrics that caught the light and sparkled. Their hair was styled into elaborate, gravity-defying shapes, and their faces were painted with flawless makeup. They moved in small, confident groups, laughing and rehearsing their lines, their voices polished and smooth. Ilara kept her head down, feeling like a wildflower that had accidentally been planted in a perfectly manicured garden of roses she hadn't even really wanted to audition. It was her best friend, Chloe, who had filled out the online form on a whim one rainy afternoon. "You have to, Ilara. You're the best singer I've ever heard," Chloe had insisted, her eyes bright with excitement. Ilara had just laughed, shaking her head. Her singing was a private thing, a comfort she shared with the wide-open fields and the quiet, listening cows. It was a language she spoke with her grandmother before she passed away, a memory she held close to her heart. But Chloe was persistent, and so, with a sigh and a feeling of absurdity, Ilara had recorded a short video on her phone in the barn. She sang an old folk song, her voice echoing softly in the dusty, sunlit space. She never expected to hear anything back. When the call came, she thought it was a prank. A sleek, official-sounding voice on the other end of the line told her she had been selected for the live auditions of National Spotlight, the biggest talent show on television. The world tilted on its axis. Her parents were supportive but worried, their faces a mixture of pride and fear. They didn't have the money for a fancy trip to the city, but the show had offered to cover everything. And so here she was, 1,000 miles from home, feeling like an imposter. The only thing that kept her feet rooted to the sticky floor of the backstage area was the thought of her grandmother. She remembered the old woman's wrinkled hands, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she listened. "You have a gift, my little songbird," she used to say. "Don't ever let the world tell you to be quiet." This felt like the scariest way to honor that memory. A woman with a clipboard and a headset barked her name. "Ilara, you're up in 2. Get ready." The woman didn't smile, her eyes scanning a list, her finger tracing a line down the page. Ilara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She was guided towards a mark on the floor, a single piece of white tape that seemed to hold the weight of all her dreams and fears. She could hear the host's voice, muffled and distant, introducing her. "And next, we have a young lady who has come all the way from the countryside to share her voice with us. Please give a warm welcome to Ilara." This was it. The stage manager gave her a small, almost imperceptible push. "Go on." She took a step, and then another, her boots feeling heavy and clumsy. The world shrank to the blinding wall of lights in front of her. She couldn't see the audience, just a vast, dark void that seemed to stretch on forever. The heat from the lights was intense, warming her face and making her dress feel suddenly too warm. She walked towards the single microphone standing in the center of the massive stage, its silver top gleaming like a distant star. It felt like a mile-long walk. Every sound was amplified, the soft thud of her boots, the rustle of her dress. the frantic thumping of her own heart in her ears. Finally, she reached the microphone and curled her fingers around its cool, metal stand. She blinked, her eyes slowly adjusting to the light. She could see them now. The three judges, seated behind a long, imposing desk. They looked like giants. The one in the middle, a famous record producer known for his ruthless business sense, was leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed. He was looking at her not with curiosity but with a kind of bored calculation, as if he were assessing a product on a shelf. To his right sat a pop superstar, a woman with a famously sharp tongue and an even sharper fashion sense. She was meticulously examining her own fingernails, a look of utter disinterest on her perfectly made-up face. Only the judge on the far left, an older, gentle-looking folk musician, offered a small, kind smile. But even his smile seemed to hold a flicker of doubt, a hint of pity for the girl who looked so lost. The host, a man with a blindingly white smile and too much gel in his hair, approached her. "So, Elara," he said, his voice booming through the arena, "tell us, what brings you here tonight?" His tone was cheerful, but it felt practiced, like he'd asked the same question 100 times already. Elara leaned into the microphone, her own voice sounding small and shaky. I just like to sing," she managed to say. The host chuckled. "Well, we like that. And where are you from?" "A small town," she whispered, "on a farm." A few light chuckles rippled through the dark audience. The pop star judge looked up from her nails for a moment, her eyes sweeping over Elara's simple dress and worn boots before she let out an almost inaudible sigh and looked away again. The record producer shifted in his seat, already looking impatient. "And what are you going to sing for us today?" The host pressed .elar took a shaky breath. This was the part she was most nervous about. "It's an old aria," she said quietly. "It's called O mio babino caro." The host's smile faltered for just a second. The pop star judge actually rolled her eyes, a quick, dismissive gesture that was caught by a camera and flashed on the large screens on either side of the stage. A wave of murmurs went through the audience. It was a bold, almost ridiculous choice for a girl like her. The record producer sighed audibly and lifted his hand, hovering it over the large red button in front of him. The buzzer? The signal of failure? Elara saw it all, and a cold dread washed over her. She had made a terrible mistake. She closed her eyes, shutting out the judges, the audience, the entire world. She just focused on the memory of her grandmother's smiling face, and the music began to play. The first few notes from the piano floated through the heavy air, gentle and questioning. For Elara, they were a lifeline. The sound cut through the roaring in her ears, pushing back the wall of fear that had been closing in on her. She kept her eyes squeezed shut, not wanting to see the bored faces of the judges or the vast, dark void of the audience. She just needed to be alone with the music, just for a few more seconds. The melody was familiar, a dear old friend she had known for years. It was the song her grandmother had played on their crackly old record player, a disc so worn and scratched that the music sounded like it was being sung through a layer of dust. She could almost smell the attic now, the scent of old paper and cedar chests. The way a single sunbeam would cut through the grimy window, illuminating the dancing dust motes. Her grandmother hadn't known Italian. She didn't know what the words meant, but she knew what they felt. "This is a song about loving someone so much you'd do anything, even jump in a river," she had told Elara, her eyes twinkling. "You don't need to know the words to feel that in your bones." And they would sing along together. Elara's young, clear voice trying to mimic the powerful soprano from the record, while her grandmother hummed a soft, slightly off-key harmony. It was their secret ritual, a world built just for two, filled with music and unspoken love. Now, standing on this massive, terrifying stage, that memory was her anchor. It was the only thing keeping her from being swept away by the current of her own panic. As the piano continued its gentle introduction, she could feel the skepticism in the room like a physical weight. It was pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. She knew what they were seeing. A girl in a faded dress, with dirt still clinging to the solace of her boots. A joke, a filler segment for the show. She imagined the record producer, the man in the middle, looking at his watch, already calculating how much airtime this disaster would waste. She could almost hear the pop star's sigh, a puff of impatience. They were waiting for her to fail. They were expecting it. The thought sent a fresh wave of cold dread through her. Her throat felt tight, as if someone were wrapping their hands around it. What if her voice wouldn't come? What if it came out as a squeak, a pathetic, trembling sound? What if she proved them right? The producer's hand, she could feel it, was still hovering over that dreaded red button. She didn't have to see it to know. She could feel his eagerness to press it, to end this before it even began. He wanted the buzz, the signal of failure that would send her scurrying off the stage in humiliation. The pop star was probably checking her reflection in her phone, utterly bored. Only the folk musician on the end, the one with the kind eyes, seemed to be holding on to a sliver of hope. But even his hope felt fragile, like a candle flame in a strong wind. He was probably just a nice person. Feeling sorry for the little farm girl who was clearly out of her depth, the piano swelled, the melody rising towards its peak, signaling that her moment was coming. The intro was almost over. This was it. The point of no return. Ilara took one last, silent breath, the air catching in her chest. She thought of her grandmother's words. Don't ever let the world tell you to be quiet. She thought of the wide-open fields of home, the feeling of the wind on her face, the solid ground beneath her feet. She was not just this scared girl on a stage. She was the granddaughter of a woman who found magic in old records. She was the girl who sang to the cows and the chickens and the endless sky. She had a voice, and it was time to let it out, and then she opened her mouth and sang. The sound that came out was not her own. It was bigger than her, older than her, more powerful than she could have ever imagined. It wasn't the quiet, shaky voice she had used to introduce herself. It was a thread of pure, molten gold, pulled from the deepest part of her soul and stretched across the entire auditorium. The first note hung in the air, perfect and shimmering, so full of raw emotion that it seemed to silence everything else. It was a sound that didn't just fill the room. It changed the room. The air itself felt different, charged with an electric current of shock and awe. In the judge's panel, a frozen tableau of disbelief formed. The record producer's hand, which had been hovering over the red button of rejection, was now frozen in midair, a statue of pure astonishment. His eyes, which had been narrowed with bored calculation, were now wide open, staring at the stage as if he were witnessing a miracle. The cynical smirk was gone, replaced by an expression of utter, unadulterated shock. The pop star, who had been examining her fingernails with detached interest. Her head snapped up so fast it was a wonder she didn't get whiplash. Her mouth fell open slightly, the practiced mask of indifference shattering into a million pieces. Her perfectly penciled eyebrows shot up towards her hairline, her eyes locked on the small figure at the microphone. The whisper she had been about to utter died on her lips. Forgotten, even the audience, the vast, dark void was completely still. The restless shuffling, the coughs, the murmurs, all of it had vanished. There was not a single sound in the massive arena except for the voice coming from the girl in the simple dress. It was a voice that didn't belong to her, a voice that seemed to come from another time and place. It was a voice that had known sorrow and joy. A voice that had lived 100 lifetimes and was now telling their stories in a single, breathtaking note. As the first note faded and the melody of the aria began to unfold. Something shifted inside Ilara. The fear was still there. A faint hum in the background, but it was no longer in control. It had been pushed aside by something stronger, the music. She was no longer thinking about the judges or the audience or the possibility of failure. She wasn't even thinking about the notes or the words. She was just feeling. She was channeling all the love she had for her grandmother, all the loneliness she had felt on the farm, all the hope and fear that had brought her to this stage, and pouring it all into the song. Her body, which had been rigid with terror, began to relax. Her grip on the microphone stand loosened. She lifted her head slightly, her eyes still closed, her face a mask of profound, heartbreaking emotion. She was no longer just a contestant on a talent show. She was a storyteller, and her story was stopping the world in its tracks. The silence that followed that first, perfect note was a living thing. It wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a presence, a heavy, sacred blanket that had fallen over the entire arena. In that silence, you could have heard a pin drop, but no one would have dared to move. Every single person, from the camera operators in the wings to the security guards at the back, was frozen. They were all prisoners of that voice, captivated by the impossible sound that had come from the unassuming girl in the simple dress. The piano continued, its gentle chords providing a soft bed for the melody that was now flowing from Alara like a river dot as she sang the next lines. Her voice began to tell a story. It wasn't just a string of beautiful notes. It was a conversation, a plea, a desperate whisper. She sang of longing, her voice soft and trembling with a vulnerability that was almost painful to witness. It was the sound of a young girl standing at a window, watching the world go by, feeling utterly alone. For the record producer, this was a language he understood but had forgotten. He spent his days crafting polished, auto-tuned hits, songs designed to be catchy and sell. This was different. This was real. It was messy and imperfect and utterly captivating. He found himself leaning forward, his elbows on the desk, his cynical mind completely silent. All his calculations about marketability and image had evaporated, replaced by a single, overwhelming thought. He was listening to something truly special, the pop star. The woman who had built an empire on flawless performances and a carefully constructed public persona felt a strange and unfamiliar pang in her chest. She watched Alara, whose eyes were still closed, completely lost in the music. There was no performance here, no attempt to work the camera or strike a pose. There was only pure, unfiltered emotion. The pop star thought of her own beginnings, of the joy she once felt in just singing, before the contracts and the stylists and the pressure to be perfect had taken over. She saw a ghost of her younger self on that stage, a ghost she had long ago buried under layers of makeup and expectation. A single perfect tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, a tiny crack in her impenetrable facade. She quickly wiped it away, but the damage was done. The armor had been breached. The folk musician on the end was no longer just smiling. He was beaming, his face lit up with a pure, unadulterated joy. He had spent his life championing authenticity, the raw and honest sound of a human heart speaking through music. And here it was in its most potent form. He understood what Alara was doing. She wasn't just singing an old Italian song. She was singing about her home, her grandmother, her loneliness, her hope. She was weaving all of it into the melody, creating a tapestry of sounds so rich and detailed that you could see the pictures she was painting. He nodded slowly, a gesture of deep respect and understanding. This girl wasn't just a contestant. She was a fellow artist, a true storyteller. Out in the audience, the spell was deepening. The initial shock was giving way to a collective emotional response. A young woman in the third row, who had come to the show with her friends for a fun night out, was now sobbing quietly, her makeup smearing. She didn't know the words to the song, but she knew exactly what Alara was feeling. An old man, a music teacher who had retired years ago, felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard thousands of voices in his lifetime, but he had never heard one like this. It was a voice that came along once in a generation, if you were lucky. People all around the arena were turning to their neighbors, their eyes wide with disbelief, mouthing the same silent question. Is this real? Phones, which had been used for texting and scrolling just moments before, were now held up in the air, their screens glowing like a galaxy of stars, all pointed at the stage. Trying to capture a piece of the magic, Alara was unaware of any of this. In her mind, she was no longer on a stage in a brightly lit arena. She was back in the attic with her grandmother. She was walking through the fields at dusk, the air cool on her skin. She was pouring all the love, pain, and hope she had ever felt into every single note. Her voice, which had started as a gentle stream, was now beginning to swell. The song was building towards its climax, its most demanding moment. The melody rose higher and higher, a testament to the incredible control and power she possessed. Her body, which had been still, began to move with the music. Her free hand rose slowly, her fingers uncurling as if reaching for something invisible in the air. Her face, once a mask of concentration, was now a canvas of pure emotion, and then she reached it. The highest, most sustained note of the entire piece. It was a note that could shatter glass, a note that required immense breath control and perfect pitch. As she hit it, her voice soared, clear and strong and impossibly beautiful. It didn't just fill the arena. It seemed to expand beyond it, a sound that could have reached the stars. In that moment, time seemed to stop. The world held its breath. The three judges were completely motionless, their faces frozen in expressions of pure awe. The audience was a sea of upturned faces, their mouths open, their eyes shining with tears. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated perfection, a fleeting glimpse of something divine. She held the note, her voice unwavering, a pillar of sound in the silent hall. And then, as gently as it had begun, it started to fade. She brought the note down, softening it, letting it melt back into the melody until it was just a whisper, a final, tender sigh. The last chord of the piano echoed and then died, leaving a silence that was even more profound than the one before. For a full 3 seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. The moment was too sacred, too precious to break. Ilara stood there, her eyes still closed, her hand slowly lowering to her side. She was still lost in her world of music and memory. Then she slowly opened her eyes. The blinding lights came back into focus. The dark void of the audience began to resolve into individual shapes. And then the world exploded. The silence was shattered by a sound so loud it felt like a physical force. It was a roar, a deafening, thunderous wave of applause that shook the very foundations of the building. Every single person in the audience was on their feet, clapping, cheering, screaming, "Bravo!" at the top of their lungs. The sound was overwhelming, a tidal wave of adoration that crashed over the stage. Ilara flinched, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. She looked out at the sea of people, all standing for her, all cheering for her, and a look of pure disbelief spread across her face. She took a small, shaky step back from the microphone as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. The spell was broken, and she was just a girl from a farm again, standing on a stage, being celebrated by thousands of people for doing the one thing she loved most in the world. The sound that hit Ilara was not just loud. It was a physical force. It was a solid wall of noise that seemed to push against her, making her sway on her feet. The roar of thousands of people clapping and cheering at the same time was something she had only ever heard on television, a distant, muffled sound. But this was real. It was alive. It vibrated through the floorboards, up the metal stand of the microphone, and into the very bones of her trembling body. The air itself seemed to thicken with the energy of it, a hot, heavy wave of pure adoration. For a moment she was terrified. Her mind, still floating in the soft, quiet world of the song, couldn't process the sudden, violent explosion of sound and light. She just stood there, her eyes wide and unblinking, like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truck. She saw them now, not as a dark void, but as individual faces. Every single person was on their feet. Their mouths were open, shouting things she couldn't understand. Their hands were raised, clapping in a frantic, joyful rhythm. She saw young people with tears streaming down their faces, old men with their hands on their hearts, women holding their phones up, not to record, but just to capture a piece of the moment, as if trying to bottle the lightning that had just struck the stage. They were all looking at her. Their faces were a mixture of shock, joy, and pure, unadulterated awe. It was too much. She felt a dizzying rush of vertigo, a feeling that she might just dissolve into the blinding lights and disappear. Her first instinct was to run, to turn around, flee back into the familiar shadows of the wings, and hide until it all went away. But then her eyes found the judge's table, and her feet felt rooted to the spot. The scene there was a portrait of absolute shock. The record producer, the man who had been ready to buzz her off the stage, was now standing, his chair pushed back so forcefully it had nearly toppled over. His jaw was hanging slack, his arms limp at his sides. He wasn't looking at her like a product anymore. He was looking at her like he had just witnessed the impossible. The cynical mask was gone, replaced by a look of raw, unfiltered wonder. He was a man who had seen it all, and this was something new. Beside him, the pop star was a mess. Her perfect makeup was streaked with black lines of mascara where tears had carved paths down her cheeks. She was clapping her hands together so hard it looked like it hurt. Her eyes locked on Ilara with an intensity that was almost frightening. She was no longer the cool, untouchable superstar. She was just another person in the audience, completely undone by the power of a single song. The eye roll, the sigh of boredom, it all seemed like a lifetime ago, a foolish mistake from a different person. She looked humbled, stripped of all her defenses, and utterly captivated. Even the gentle folk musician was on his feet, but his reaction was different. He wasn't in shock. He was in pure, unadulterated bliss. He was beaming, his face glowing with a fatherly pride. He was clapping and cheering, not just for the performance, but for the girl. He had seen the spark in her from the beginning, and now he was watching it erupt into a brilliant, undeniable fire. He was nodding his head, a slow, steady rhythm of yes, 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 as if he had known all along that this was going to happen. The host, a man who was a master of controlling the chaos of a live show, looked just as stunned as everyone else. He finally seemed to remember his job, holding up his hands and trying to quiet the crowd, but it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a bucket. The roar continued for another full minute before it began to subside, settling into a deafening, rhythmic chant of her name. Ilara, 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 the sound of her name, a name that had always been so quiet and ordinary, being chanted by thousands of people was the most surreal thing she had ever experienced. When the noise finally died down enough for him to be heard, the host approached her slowly, his voice soft and filled with a reverence she had never heard from him before. Ilara, he said, his microphone trembling slightly in his hand. I don't know what to say. I think I speak for everyone here when I say that we were not expecting that. He paused, shaking his head in disbelief. What just happened here? Where did that come from? Ilara leaned into the microphone, her own voice sounding small and fragile after the power of her singing. She looked down at her scuffed boots, suddenly feeling shy again. I just sing, she whispered, her voice barely audible in the now silent arena. It's for my grandma. The simplicity of her answer, the quiet honesty in her voice, seemed to hit the audience and the judges even harder than the song had. It was the key that unlocked everything. This wasn't a calculated performance. It was a gift. It was a tribute. The host nodded, his own eyes glistening. He turned to the judges' table. Okay, he said, taking a deep breath. Let's hear what you have to say. He looked at the folk musician on the end. The older man smiled warmly at Ilara. My dear, he said, his voice thick with emotion. In a world full of noise, you just gave us a moment of pure, beautiful music. That was a gift. Thank you. He didn't even need to say the word. His yes was written all over his face. The host then turned to the pop star. She took a moment, wiping her eyes with a tissue and taking a shaky breath. She looked directly at Ilara, her gaze steady and sincere. I need to apologize, she said, her voice cracking slightly. When you came out on this stage, I saw a girl in a simple dress and I made a judgment. And I was wrong. I was so wrong. She paused, collecting herself. What you just did, it wasn't singing. It was truth. It was the most real, most honest thing I have ever heard on this stage or any stage. You reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. You are a true artist, and I am so sorry I ever doubted you. She looked down at her panel and pressed the button that lit up her yes sign with a decisive, emphatic click. Finally, all eyes were on the record producer. He was still standing, staring at Ilara as if he were trying to solve a complex puzzle. He sat down slowly, leaning forward and steepling his fingers under his chin. He was quiet for a long time, the silence stretching out, making everyone hold their breath. I have been in this business for 30 years, he said, his voice low and serious. I have signed superstars. I have produced platinum records. I have heard thousands of voices, and I have never in my entire career heard anything like that. He looked from Alara to the other judges and then back again. What you have is not something that can be taught. It's not something that can be manufactured. It is a once-in-a-generation, lightning in a bottle kind of talent. It's the kind of thing that people like me spend their entire careers searching for and never find. He leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. It wasn't a cynical smile. It was the smile of a man who had just struck gold. We would be fools to let you walk off this stage. It's an absolute, resounding yes from me. The last IES lit up and the arena erupted again. The host officially declared her through to the next round, but his words were almost lost in the noise. Ilara just stood there, a single tear of her own finally tracing a path down her cheek. She looked out at the standing, cheering crowd, at the three judges who had been transformed from skeptics into believers, and for the first time she felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was a tiny, fragile spark of belief in herself. She gave a small, shaky wave to the audience, then turned and walked off the stage, her boots feeling a little lighter, her back a little straighter as she disappeared into the wings, leaving a changed world behind her. The moment Ilara stepped back into the wings, the world came rushing back in a dizzying, chaotic wave. The silence of the stage was replaced by a cacophony of shouts, running feet, and the frantic crackle of headsets. Her legs, which had carried her through the performance with a strength she didn't know she possessed, now felt like noodles, wobbling and threatening to give way. She leaned against the rough brick wall of the backstage area, her chest heaving, trying to catch a breath that wouldn't come. The ringing in her ears was so loud it drowned everything else out. A high-pitched scream that was the ghost of the audience's roar, a woman with a clipboard. The same one who had barked her name with such impatience before rushed towards her. But her face was completely different. The hard, professional mask was gone, replaced by a wide, genuine smile. Her eyes were shining. Oh my goodness, that was incredible, she stammered, holding out a bottle of water. Here, drink this. You must be exhausted. Ilara took the bottle, her hands shaking so much she could barely unscrew the cap. The cool water was a shock to her system, but it helped clear her head. Suddenly she was surrounded. People in suits with headsets, people carrying cameras, people with microphones emblazoned with the show's logo. They were all talking at once, a barrage of questions and congratulations that she couldn't possibly process. How do you feel? Where did you learn to sing like that? We need to get you to makeup for the post-show interview. Ilara just stared at them, her mouth slightly open, feeling like a small animal caught in a stampede. She wanted to run, to find a quiet corner and just be alone for a minute, to understand what had just happened. Through the crowd, she saw a familiar face. It was the kind-eyed folk musician from the judges' panel. He had managed to slip past the chaos. He didn't have a microphone or a camera. He just walked up to her and put a gentle hand on her shoulder. Breathe, my dear, he said softly, his voice a calm anchor in the storm. Just breathe. It's overwhelming right now, but it's going to be okay. His simple kindness was the thing that finally broke through the wall of shock. A single tear, the first one she had allowed herself to shed, rolled down her cheek. He just smiled and patted her shoulder. You did a beautiful thing. A truly beautiful thing. A few minutes later, after being ushered into a small, brightly lit room, a phone was pressed into her hand. It's your parents, a producer said, his voice full of excitement. Ilara's heart skipped a beat. Her parents. She put the phone to her ear, her hand still trembling. Mom? Dad? Ilara, oh sweetie, we saw you. We saw you. It was her mother's voice, choked with happy tears. In the background, she could hear the sound of other people cheering and clapping. The whole town is here. They're all at our house, watching on the big screen in the town hall. You did it, honey. You really did it. Then her father's voice came on the line, deep and steady, but with an unmistakable tremor of pride. That's my girl, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I always knew you had that in you. Your grandmother? She would have been so proud. Hearing him say that Hearing the joy and love in their voices was more real and more meaningful than the standing ovation, more precious than the judge's praise. This was why she had done it. Not for fame or for a golden ticket to the next round, but for this moment of connection with the people she loved most in the world. "I love you guys," she whispered into the phone. A fresh wave of tears streaming down her face. Later that night, tucked away in the quiet of her plain hotel room, the world outside still buzzing with the energy of her performance, Ilara finally saw it for herself. She hesitantly opened the laptop the show had provided and typed her name into the search bar. The screen exploded. There were dozens of articles, news reports, and blog posts, all with her face on them. And then she saw the video. It was the clip from the show, uploaded to the show's official channel. The title read, "The Girl Who Silenced the Judges." She clicked on it, her heart pounding. The view count was a number she couldn't even comprehend. It was in the millions. And it was climbing faster than she could blink. She watched herself walk out on stage, saw the look of fear on her own face, saw the eye roll from the pop star. And then she listened. She heard the voice that came out of her, and it was like watching someone else. It didn't sound like her. It sounded bigger, stronger, more beautiful than she could have ever imagined. She scrolled down to the comments, expecting to find criticism or jokes. But that's not what she found. The comments were a river of emotion. "I'm a 45-year-old man, and I haven't cried in 10 years. I'm sobbing right now. My grandmother passed away last year, and this was her favorite song. Thank you for bringing her back to me for a moment. This isn't just singing, this is healing. Who is this girl? We need more of this in the world." For every comment, there were thousands of likes. She wasn't just a contestant anymore. She had become a feeling, a shared moment of catharsis for complete strangers all over the world. The next morning, the world was a different place. Her phone, which had been so quiet just a day before, would not stop ringing. It wasn't just her parents calling. It was managers, publicists, record label executives, and producers from other television shows. They all wanted a piece of the girl from the farm with the voice of an angel. They talked about contracts, about album deals, about world tours. The words were foreign and intimidating, a language she didn't speak. They spoke of her as if she were a product, a discovery, a gold mine. It was overwhelming and a little bit frightening. In the middle of a phone call with a very important-sounding man from a famous record label, Ilara's eyes drifted to the corner of the room. There, sitting side by side, were her worn-out leather boots. They were still scuffed and dusty, a stubborn reminder of the world she came from. Looking at them, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. The boots were still the same, and she was still the same girl who wore them. The world could change around her. People could offer her fame and fortune. But that part of her, the core of who she was, would remain. In the weeks that followed, Ilara's life transformed in ways she could never have predicted. She became a household name, her face on the cover of magazines, her story inspiring millions. But she handled it with the same quiet grace she had shown on that stage. She was polite but firm, turning down offers that didn't feel right, insisting on staying true to the music that mattered to her. She didn't move to a mansion in a big city. Instead, she used the money she had earned to build a small, beautiful music studio on her family's farm, a place where she could sing and write and remember her grandmother. One evening, a few months later, she was sitting on the porch of that farmhouse, strumming a guitar and watching the sun set over the fields. A reporter from a major news network was there, doing a story on her meteoric rise to fame. The reporter asked her, "So what's next for you, Ilara? What are your big dreams now?" Ilara stopped strumming the guitar and looked out at the horizon, where the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink. She thought about the roaring crowd, the flashing lights, the judge's apologies. But then she thought about the quiet of the attic, the smell of old paper, and her grandmother's smiling face. "My dream," she said softly, her voice clear and steady, "is to write a song that makes someone feel the way my grandmother's music made me feel. That's all. Everything else is just noise." And as she began to play a new melody, A song born from the soil and the sky and a love that never faded. She knew she had already won. The show had just been the beginning. The real music was just getting started.